Hello and welcome to FireDEV. In this episode, I have Raouf Bejaoui. Raouf, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Fantastic. So, you work for Naughty Dog. You work as a technical art director. Before we, go into that, how did you, just get into the games industry in general? Because Naughty Dog isn't the first gaming company you've worked for. So, how did you get into it? And, has gaming always been a passion for you since you were a child?
Yeah, so I got into the games industry about 15 years ago, more or less. I had a career in engineering before that. I actually had like a little segue in the software industry in between. So I kind of had like a natural, you know, kind of like engineering transition between two different industries. Um, so yeah, I mean, my background is mostly on the engineering side. I did 3 years of computer graphic studies in between because I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do back then. I knew that it was video games, but what exactly in video games, wasn't entirely sure. So I started with engineering. Then I did a couple of years as a CG artist, and later on, just naturally morphed into technical arts. Just essentially going back to my roots, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean that totally makes sense. So, doing that, was there ever any sort of hesitation or pushback from your parents? Because when you're saying to your parents that you want to become like programmer nowadays is kind of is kind of acceptable now, like some form of engineer compared to if you want to do doctor or lawyer, where they're over the moon. The but saying you want to be a programmer and then on top of that you want to be a games programmer. They don't hear the programming side. They hear games and they think you're going to play games all day and waste your life. Like, did you ever have any pushback from family?
That is an interesting question because I think even up until today, I'm not entirely sure that my any of my family members actually understand what I'm doing. They probably think I'm doing like archviz or stuff like that. Like they know it's related to computers and 3D and CG, but I'm not entirely sure they get that is like video game development. So yeah, no, you absolutely right. Especially any kind of like arts related jobs. My parents back then didn't really consider that a job, to be honest. It's like it's entertainment, right? When you talk about
Mm.
video games, first thing that comes to mind is it's not a job because you playing games. Like, no, I'm not playing games. I want to make games, and that's work, and that's hard work, right? So yeah, you're absolutely right. There was a lot of pushback.
Yeah, because I mean, it's a nice distinction that you made there. That it's seen as entertainment, and it's something like doctor, lawyer, even working in a supermarket, whatever it is, it's seen more as work and almost less fun, like it's more boring and tiresome. And the let's say the game side of it, or let's say music as well, is seen more as like the fun side, whether it's the consumerization of
Mm,
these materials, whether you're just consuming it at home or even the making of it, even though and I know it's not always fun and it is difficult, but they don't see that side of it. And it's like, if you hear someone, I'm sure you get the same, thing. If you hear someone as a kid and they say they want to be an actor, you kind of think, okay, like, grow up. Like,
yeah, it's a hobby.
there's actors and
Yeah.
the people that do well financially. So let's just put the financial side part of it aside for now. It's like how many people does the average person know personally there are actors? It's like not really. Like everyone knows a doctor at least, and everyone will know a lawyer, some sort of engineer, some sort of manager somewhere, project manager, and then more people are beginning to know programmers and engineers as well. But yeah, I guess he was kind of like that. Where it's just like I don't know anyone that's a games programmer, what you're talking about, Ralph. So they're probably thinking,
Yeah.
yeah, obviously people do it, but they couldn't, I guess, connect the dots and see the path to get there. That was obvious. Like to doctor, they're
Yeah.
like, okay, you got to do the sciences, do well, do like what 5, 6, 7 years at university, done. You're like, though it might be difficult, they could see the steps.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the difficulty also back then is that there weren't really any real curriculum,
Mm-hmm.
like from on the academia side of things. Like there weren't really any like video game schools or anything like that. I mean, today there's a gazillion of them. I mean, every major university out there has a video game somehow, like some video game related curriculums, right? Whatever that's arts, engineering, game design, whatever it may be. Um, that wasn't really the case back in my days. So you got into the games industry mostly via art or engineering, mostly engineering back then. And yeah, I mean, for any young, aspiring game developer back then, in high school or even in middle school, um, the 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 path to get there wasn't really as straightforward, I would say, as it is today. So yeah, it required a lot of investigation, experimentation as well. Like you probably would start your engineering career in another industry and then eventually land a job in the games industry. So yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Because I've had a lot of people on the podcast, and the older ones that have been in the gaming industry for quite a long time now. None of them, like you just talked about, none of them did a specific, games type of course. Because when I went to university between 2010 and 2014, I did computer games programming. And that was not the only games degree on top of computer science available. Like there was computer game programming, there was game design, there was something to do with audio as well. I can't remember what the audio course was called, but there was about 4 or 5 at least that I knew of game related courses. And then outside of that, there were more sort of, I guess, media related courses. And then you had, the obvious, the computer science, the maths. So yeah, there are so many courses. And even before that, you get it in, obviously you're in, America, but in the UK, before you go to university, or, you call it college, we have college, which is like the last couple of years of school for you guys. And in those years, you can do computer science, maths, biology, those subjects. But some, colleges here are allowing you to do some sort of games, related course, and they even bring in, that as part of the IT curriculum, in high schools. Obviously, it's limited in scope what they're doing, but they're bringing in. They're talking about some design. They're talking about some programming with some sort of rudimentary, WYSIWYG software. So definitely there's a lot more exposure. But like I was saying, people that I've had on the podcast that have been doing it for ages, they're like, yeah, I just did computer science, and I just happened to get into the gaming industry. Like I did this job, I did this contract, and then somebody at some gaming company I knew, like a friend via a friend, said, "You want to, try this?" And they thought, it sounded interesting to them. And then if you go further back than that, there was a time when there wasn't even computer science related courses, and it was a matter of just tinkering. And those, older guys didn't even either didn't do a degree or a computer science degree, maybe engineering, electrical engineering, and they happened to just get into it because they tinkered away. Obviously, back then you had to have some rudimentary, knowledge of how computers worked and how they, fit together just to use them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I look back at my, you know, um, academic curriculum, it was actually quite chaotic, to be honest, because I started studying mathematics, which was pretty generic, I would say, at the time. Then I studied electronics, computer science. Then I landed a job as a junior software engineer for roughly a year, and decided that it wasn't really for me. It wasn't so much like the engineering side of things. It's just that the industry I was working in at the time, it wasn't really my cup of tea. And so I went back to school and pursued a computer graphics degree at the time. It was relatively new in the early 2000s, and 3 years later, yeah, just landed my first job in the games industry. So, yeah, going from like when I look back at it, it's like mathematics, electronics, computer science, and then video games. It's kind of odd, isn't it? I mean, when
Yeah.
you look at it today, there are straighter paths, I would say, to get into the games industry.
Yeah, no,
Definitely.
100%. But what I will say is that it's not that atypical of a path, because I know a lot of electrical engineers that throughout their career have, done a bit of like programming, like they've tinkered with it or they've had to. Or like, I remember when I was at college and our maths teacher, I remember me and a friend was talking about the work in computer science, and he knew what we was talking about, and we was like shocked, and he was like, I did a bit of programming as part of my maths degree. So it's not that atypical of a path, because I've had people on here that they were a nurse. Straight away, they became a VFX artist. Went to work for a company that actually had someone that was at Naughty Dog. Now he's at Respawn Entertainment. I've had somebody that was a lawyer. Turned live ops manager in a games company. So I've had all sorts of stuff. But yeah, it's not as straight of a path as you could go. Computer science,
Yeah.
IT. Doing that and then landing the job. So whilst you was doing your graphics degree, was you still working at the same time? Because at that point you already had a degree, just not in games, specifically. So it was an additional one. So was you still working at the same time, and how was you like funding it? I guess.
Um, I mean, I had a few like freelancing jobs here and there, but it wasn't like full time. Anything. I was really wanted to focus on my studies back then. So no, I wasn't still working. I studied in Belgium, so education is free actually there. So it was just about rent
Hmm. The
and all
general
the other
expenses.
expenses.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And like so the education in Belgium, for example, which is free, is that free for anyone that goes, or do you need some sort of like?
Anyway.
So okay, so you can go there. So if you've never lived there, you could literally just go for the degree. Then is that correct?
Uh, I think it is. So I was born and raised in France. So it could be that it's only for countries within the European Union. I
I
have
guess so.
no idea. It could be that, but to my knowledge, education is free for everybody.
Okay, that's
Yeah,
interesting. And how is it in France? Because you did your computer science degree in France.
correct. So the problem back then in France is that there weren't really anything for computer graphics. I mean, there were a few schools, but they weren't public schools. They were
Mm.
private, and they were pretty pricey, and I just couldn't afford it. It actually turned out to be cheaper to move countries, to go to Belgium, get my education there. So yeah,
I mean,
things have changed since then.
yeah, I mean, it's pretty crazy that it's cheaper to move to a whole nother country
I know,
than
I
it
know.
is to, do. Obviously, it is private, but still. But yeah, it just shows that the difference in price when you do, go private. Did you have family in Belgium, or was it like a
No, I do
complete?
not.
Okay,
Yeah,
so, so you was on your own. You didn't know anyone, and you was
no,
rebuilding the connection relationship from scratch.
yeah, 100%.
I mean, how did you get through that? Those few years of your life, and through that process, because a lot of people, that are listening to the podcast, a lot of them are young. They're going through a transitional phase, like either going into university, coming out of it. So, like, how do you cope with those sort of big changes in your life?
You really do question yourself a lot because obviously it's a big change. You had a job, it was pretty stable, but being unhappy in your professional career is just like doesn't really lead to anything. And I had no problem once again with the engineering side of things. It was just the application of it, because you can be a software engineer in any industry today, and do very different things. At the end of the day, it's really all about the end products. And that, as I said, like that wasn't really my cup of tea. I was working in the telecoms industry. It was a great experience, but it was just not the field that I wanted to be in. At the same time, I mean, growing up as a kid, I've always been passionate by technology on one hand, but also the visual arts. I was always drawing, and I was always, first time I got a computer, I got a copy of 3D Studio Max, one of the very first versions, and started doing things in 3D. It has always been a passion of mine. And at that point, I guess, when I made that transition, it was very much me questioning the choices that I made and say, okay, is this the right thing for you? If it isn't, you either go 100% towards this direction or not, right? Like, you have to make a choice. And so I guess at that point, it was just about, trying to, I guess, understand myself better, if that makes any sense. Like, it's kind of hard to say today, because I know what I want to do, and I'm very happy with my career. But back then, it was very much like me searching for what would make me, happy, professionally speaking. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, I studied computer graphics, and then, as I said, couple of months after graduating, landed my first job as an artist. And I did that for about 3 or 4 years. And then there was this new trend that was coming in the video games industry called technical art, which was essentially that, blend of arts and technology. And it just fits perfectly for me, because I had, both, part of my background. So, yeah.
A lot of people have an idea of what an artist does, or they have a, an idea in the head that, okay, they'll sit down, they'll do some sort of drawing, and that basically, that's what they're thinking of an artist. But what does a technical artist do, and how does that differ from being an artist, a typical one?
Yeah, that's a loaded question, because technical art is probably one of the widest spectrum of things in the games industry. What I mean by a wide spectrum is that it can be very different from one studio to another. Sometimes even from one game project to another within the same company. Technical art is essentially anything that lands between art and engineering, and including, anything in the periphery. So we're talking about things like authoring technical kind of assets, like physics simulations, things like that. We're talking about engineering. So it's about creating, tools for the artist to do their job, whatever that's automation, just to make sure that, they don't get bogged down by production difficulties, like repetitive tasks and things like that. You can add to that things like proceduralism, for instance, which is more like, using mathematics to generate content on the fly, as opposed to having an artist like manually placing assets in a large open world, for instance. It's also anything that is more, I would say, rendering related, but isn't quite, graphics programming, like authoring things like shaders, which is how surfaces appear in a game. And then you have other, domains like animation. There we're talking about things like rigging and technical animation. So a rig is essentially what allows an animator to animate a character or a creature, a vehicle, whatever it may be. So you create a skeleton, you use, complex math to drive things like um, blend shapes and stuff like that. Like, I'm starting to use technical terms here because it is what it is. It's like creating all the tools essentially that allow an artist to do their work essentially.
Okay, so a
That
technical.
is, in a nutshell, more or less what technical arts is all about. That is all obviously also encapsulated within, and this is very specific to the video games industry, or anything that uses real time rendering as opposed to films, for instance. It also has to fit within specific technical constraints. We do real time, so players expect decent frame rates, and everything that we author from a content perspective, all the art content, the 3D models, the textures, the shaders, the animations, all of that has to fit within some very specific technical constraints, whatever that's frame rates or memory consumption, for instance. So a technical artist's job is also to make sure that everything that gets into the game fits within those particular constraints. So it's either creating tools to make sure that we sanity check all of that, or actually doing the hard work of like profiling the game and highlighting any potential bottleneck, and come up with a solution for it.
So a technical artist, basically can be anything from someone who's doing little to no coding, just heavy on the art side, to actually doing a fair bit of coding, creating, shaders, for example. How does somebody, if they have a clear idea, let's say they don't want to go down the coding side of it, but they like the idea of the other aspects of technical art, how do they orient their education, either through degree or self-learning, and finding a job to make sure they get that? And also the other way, if they like the idea of creating shaders and doing, let's say, OpenGL, Vulkan, that sort of work, how do they orientate themselves towards that?
Okay, so to answer the first part of the question, I would say for anybody who really wants to remain within like the domain of like art and actually making content, I would say an art curriculum, video game art curriculum is probably the best thing they can do. We tend to call those people like power users. Like, they're generally people who really have a deep understanding on the softwares that we use, like Maya, Houdini, whatever it may be. Um, Now, when it comes to shaders, there's that one is a little bit more tricky because you might also get into graphics programming at this point. I mean, if this is really like what you are passionate about, then a career in engineering and specializing in graphics programming is probably um, what you want to go for. If it's really a blend of art and technology, and you're really passionate about making shaders, I'm not sure I can really give like any advice for any aspiring technical artist today when it comes to school curriculums, because I honestly don't really know what's out there. I know there are video games curriculums. Is there anything specific to technical art? I am not entirely sure. Only thing I would say is this: you really need to work on both ends and get strong foundations on both ends of the spectrums. Like, you need to have good, art fundamentals, and some, basic engineering knowledge, and work your way from there. Traditionally speaking, TAs tend to come from other disciplines. Um, you Although things have changed, in recent years, we have more and more people who come in the industry as technical artists, junior technical artists. TAs, traditionally speaking, were mostly coming from other art disciplines. So you start your career as, I don't know, an animator, and then you morph into, a technical animator later on. You have this experience as an animator. You know how to animate, characters and creatures, and so on. Um, but you've essentially grown an interest for technology, how things work under the hood, and start solving your own problems. Like if you have, I give a very basic example here, which is very well known in technical art, which is to automate repetitive tasks, right? If you find yourself as an artist repeating the same thing over and over again, and you decide one day to say, you know what, I'm going to learn some scripting, like I'm going to learn some Python or some C sharp, and I'm going to automate this process just to unblock yourself, right? Just to help with your own workflow. That is actually the best way for me to gain some experience to eventually become a technical artist, by actually experiencing it yourself on both ends of the spectrum as an artist, and then as somebody who is using, scripting or programming in this case to solve their own problems, right?
Okay. And as a technical, artist at Naughty Dog, the creators of Last of Us, Uncharted, some, really big franchises and, beloved franchises, what do you specifically do, day to day as part of your role at Naughty Dog as a
Pretty much,
technical artist?
yeah, pretty much everything I just mentioned. Although not so much on the animation front. We have a dedicated teams of
Hmm.
TDs for that. They are dedicated to the characters and animation department, and they take care of anything related to animation technology, rigging, and what's so not. But everything else from tools, automation tools, doing shaders, implementing graphical features. Performance profiling and optimization, all that kind of stuff. It's pretty much our day to day job at Naughty Dog as TAs.
Okay, and you mentioned that Naughty Dog has specific, animators, specific technical artists that will do the the animation. Is that just common in the industry as a whole, or is that more with companies like Naughty Dog that one, they're pushing the boundaries, two, they have a heavy emphasis on the mocap work, the animation? Because when you see the latest Naughty Dog game, it's probably the most realistic, characters that you see in a video game. Even ones from 10 years ago beat a lot of video games today in terms of realism. As so, is that like that separation instead of, let's say, someone like yourself who does these other realms instead of you doing the animation as well? Is that more specific to a company like Naughty Dog that has such an emphasis on it?
I wouldn't say it's specific. I mean, my previous experience at other game studios. I mean, there's already the specialization of technical art is becoming more and more common. Technical animation has been a thing for a very long time. You have now TAs who are more specialized in proceduralism, for instance. You have other TAs who are more specialized in shading. Um, you have TAs who are dedicated to, tools and I'd say like more infrastructure kind of work. And then you have other profiles like myself who are a little bit more, I'd say, generalists, um, and do a little bit of everything. So yeah, it is very much an industry trend, and same thing actually in films. Specialization is really something that grew rapidly during the past 10 years. Like I know, for instance, in films, they even have grooming artists, for instance. They have artists whose job is essentially to make things like hair and fur on creatures, right? They're specializing in that. Um, so, yeah, it's definitely an industry trend.
Yeah, I mean, as things are becoming more complex in these projects, obviously, if it's a small game with two people, you're not gonna get all this separation. But when it's such a big game, such a big budget, and like you said with movies as well, you're gonna get people that are super specializing in all these different areas. Obviously, you mentioned grooming artists. If let's say they're making a movie like Monsters Inc., where Sully's hair is,
Yeah.
it's front and center, and it's a big showcase piece, they're gonna, have a lot of focus on it. It's like, I remember the hair in the Tomb Raider games was a huge deal, when the first Tomb Raider of the new batch, came out. And I'm sure there'll be stuff in, roles in Naughty Dog that are, so important in terms of the end product. They have their own, roles, and they have their own people just for that. I remember, like, the Batman games, the Arkham games, they had like a dude that was just dedicated to just the cape. And you might
Yeah.
think, the one dude just did the whole, like, that's all he did. But when you play the game, it's one of the takeaways from that amazing franchise is that the cape looked and felt so good. And it showed, because you didn't have
Yeah.
somebody that just quickly did a cape. Somebody did it for what, 1, 2, 3 years.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, part of it is also that some people just want to dedicate themselves to their craft, to like a very particular thing, like they're passionate about characters, for instance. So that's what they specialize in, right? Whilst other artists may want to, do a little bit of everything, right? And at the end of the day, I think within a team environment, I think it's a matter of balance. I think it's great to have a balance of specialization on one end with like experts in their fields, and on the other hand, having people who are, who can jump on various things depending on the situation.
Yeah. Okay. And so talking about Naughty Dog, which specific titles and also platforms, because they are on other platforms outside of PlayStation now. So what specific titles and platforms did you work on, and what specifically within the game? So, like, if somebody was to load the game up, you'd be like, okay, Raouf, he worked on that bit.
So the only game I've shipped so far at Naughty Dog was The Last of Us Part One, which released about a year ago on PS5 and a couple of months ago on PC. Um, I joined pretty much at the tail end of the project for the PS5 version, so mostly what I did was bug fixing and performance optimization, because that's more or less what you do at the end of a production cycle. For the PC version, I was mostly involved with the scalability side of things. So the scalability that we do on PC is essentially allowing players, using a very wide range of hardware to play, to have like a decent experience, frame rate wise. So it was about exposing those scalability settings to the user via menus, so they can adjust the quality of each graphical settings separately depending on their machines. Um, I've done a bit of shader work here and there as well, and probably a few other things that I'm missing. Um, a lot of tool works as well, but that's more like behind the scenes. Like, you don't really see it in the game. That's also part of the problem. When you work as a TA, a lot of what you do is actually not immediately visible in the end product. It's more about like the back end. Like,
Mm.
you see all that content in the game, but you have many hardworking technical artists behind that who made all the tools and set up all the workflows and the pipelines to allow the artists to author all of that beautiful content.
I mean, that's an interesting, point there, because obviously you play these games and you see all the different things and you interact with them. There's so much, behind the scenes. You said tools. There'll be obviously the game engine, because Naughty Dog has a custom game engine as well. All that side of it. When you're talking to people, I'm sure when they find out you work for Naughty Dog previously, you worked for Splash Damage, but like, you work for Naughty Dog, worked on Last of Us, working on, I think, the new Uncharted on PC as well. Like, I'm sure they're always curious about what you do. And do you ever get anybody that says, once they hear that you do maybe some behind the scenes work, do they ever say they don't really work on the game exactly? You work on something else with as a part of the company. Do you ever get that?
Uh, I do get that a lot from my wife, actually, when I play a game that worked on. I mean, the last time it was actually on Gears of War, because I worked on 3, 4 Gears games actually, and there was a cutscene playing, and I did a shader that dealt with like wetness, with like water dropping on characters
Hmm.
and stuff like that. And I was pointing the finger at the television set, saying, "Hey, I did that," and she was like, actually, what you actually do in your day-to-day job is not that noticeable. Like she was brutally honest with us. It was like, yeah, it's not that noticeable. I was like, okay, well, thank you very much. But yeah, I mean, as a technical artist, honestly, unless you work on shaders, are probably the most obvious and visible thing that you can make in a game. um, Other than that, yeah, I think most of what you do is essentially behind the scenes work, really. So
Oh yeah, and your wife saying that it's not that noticeable, or people won't read. I mean, what I will say to that is yes, like that. And I doubt somebody was watching that cutscene and heavily focusing on that, wet shader. But it's those little things that when they add up and they connect
true.
nicely, that makes you say this is an amazing game. It's like Uncharted, for example, or Last of Us is not an amazing game because they have an amazing story. That's one part of it. But without the technical execution, it's not an amazing game because they have a great animation. Because without, they could have great animation, but the models could look rubbish. The reflections could, look rubbish. Which leads back to shaders. The work that you're doing. So yeah, it's one of those things that people won't. If you just said to somebody randomly that yeah, on Gears I worked on the wet shader on this cutscene, they'll be like, what? Whereas if you said to them you worked on the main character, doing the animation, they'll be like, oh, obviously they know that because they see the main character for X amount of hours and they're heavily focusing on the main character. So yeah, it is one of those things in the back end where it's gonna get appreciated. It's just not gonna be verbal or even conscious. It's gonna be heavily unconscious. It's like audio, I would say, in games where nobody really complains too much about audio in a game. When you see a review come out and there's a lot of like let's say there's bugs, they're moaning about the visual, fidelity, it's not up to scratch, it's lagging, whatever it is. Very rarely do you see a review where they're like everything's great, but the audio's not that good. It's like it just doesn't happen because it's a more behind the scenes thing,
Yeah,
and you unconsciously notice it and you appreciate it.
it's really the sum of its parts, really. And when you look at those, part of it is also, I guess, just attention to detail. Like when you look at those things in isolation, it's true. Like it's not much, but if you were to get rid of all of those small things, you look back at it like something is off. Like it doesn't look quite right.
Mm.
Um,
Or you just wouldn't notice it. There's probably plenty of other games that have a few of these great things missing from it, and
true.
they're not memorable. Like you probably played or saw them 5, 10 years ago, and you can't even think about that game because it's just not in your memory. Whereas a game like Gears, Last of Us, Half Life, all these games through the ages, they stand out because they do so many things so well on so many levels that makes you feel like this was an amazing game.
Yeah, 100%.
So, working at Naughty Dog, what's the size of the, team like? For something like Last of Us Part 1, how many people was involved in making that game at any given point?
Whoa, I'm not entirely sure, honestly.
Would it be in
I
the
w-
hundreds?
oh yeah, definitely in the hundreds. But yeah, don't really have any figures in mind,
Not too
honestly.
sure.
Not too sure.
So I mean, if you know this, like, where is more of the focus, more on the programming side or the non-programming side in terms of the amount of people they have. Because I remember reading about games like Assassin's Creed where they have a lot of coders, but they have even more designers because of the scale of the world that they're making, and probably the same with something like GTA. Obviously, the Naughty Dog games are usually smaller in scope than those games. Higher quality, I would say, more brushed, but smaller in scope, more linear. So where is that sort of split, balance?
Yeah, I think it highly depends on the project, to be honest, because The Last of Us Part One was a remake of the original,
Mm-hmm.
so the story was already there. The game mechanics were more or less, the same. I mean, there were quite a few improvements added, but I'd say the biggest focus was very much on the art side of things because every single asset in the game has been redone. So although I don't really have the figures, I would think that the size of the art team was probably much bigger than in any other department for this particular project. Um, yeah, not sure if that answers your question. Yeah, yeah, I think it highly depends on the project. Quite frankly, it's
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point because obviously, if it's not a remake, then there you're gonna need the writers that are figuring out the story, the hashing that
yeah,
are the producers. You're gonna need the testers and the gameplay designers. 'Cause like you said, the overall gameplay was set, things were tightened, things were improved, but they knew the overall pacing of it. That wasn't being experimented. Really, it was more just emulated and slightly refined. And I guess a lot of those refinements came from The Last of Us Part Two, anyway.
yeah,
What they had learned from there. So yeah, a lot of it. A lot of the teams or the people they can effectively eliminate because they don't need it for a remake. So talking about remakes, what's your personal opinion on them? Because some people love them, like myself. If they're done well, I love being able to play like Last of Us Part One remake. Great because it was like Last of Us Part Two, slightly better technically speaking, but was able to relive that. But then you obviously have the other type of remake. Like if we talk about The Last of Us, they had the remaster where from PS3 to PS4, where things were sharpened up a bit. They ran smoother, but it was effectively still the same game. It wasn't built from scratch. And then, some people just don't like remakes at all in any form. And they're saying, like, you should just be focusing on new IP. And then sometimes the remakes can be quite costly. And when there's not been that much work done to it, because I'm trying to think, what was that remake that was announced recently? And it's not the cheapest, but there's not that Red Dead Redemption that they bring in for PS4 and Switch. A lot of people are annoyed about the price on that, and that it's not like a remake like The Last of Us Part One. So, what's your overall opinion for that whole remake remaster scene? Because that's become really big since PS3. It wasn't a thing before. Actually, I'd say PS4 heavily, but PS3 started it.
yeah. It's an interesting question actually, and the fact that you brought up Red Dead, which is actually one of my favorite games ever. The reality with Red Dead is that they are not shipping an Xbox version, as far as I know. And the reason for it is because it is backward compatible with the Xbox 360. So the reality of the situation is that the original Red Dead came out on 360 on PS3.
Mm-hmm.
The PS3 not being backwards compatible, sorry, players owning a PS4 or PS5 cannot play that game. So from that perspective, I think it makes complete sense because we we don't want games to be kind of like lost in a kind of history where they are essentially locked to one platform and essentially unplayable in a couple of years' time. So I think it was actually a great move by Rockstar. I won't comment on the pricing because that's a separate issue altogether. But from that perspective, bringing games like all the games that were sort of like locked to a particular platform to more players, I can only see that as a good thing, really. So from that perspective, again, like reaching a broader audience or modernizing an older game, I don't really see any problem at all with any of that. Like if people want to play the original, um, they can still play the original if they own the console or through other means. So yeah, I mean the Last of Us Part One is actually the second remaster I've worked on. I've also worked on the original remaster of the original Gears of War, which was pretty much like similar experience where we took a decade old game that came out back then on the Xbox 360 and essentially redid the entire art in the game whilst keeping the core gameplay mechanics the same. It was essentially the same game, but modernized visually.
Oh yeah, I remember playing the original Gears of War. What was it? What back in was it 06, 07?
It was '06, yeah.
Oh six, yeah, and then I
Yeah.
remember playing, the remaster as well, playing it, more so, and yeah, I do agree with you that it is great that companies are bringing these, games, out because like you said, they're not coming out with an Xbox version, at least not yet. Maybe that might change, but they're not because you can play the Xbox 360 version on your Xbox One and your Xbox Series consoles. You can't whack your PS3 disc in your
Mhm.
PS4 and your PS5, and obviously Nintendo doesn't have it in general. So it's great to be able to bring it to those platforms. And on obviously, I guess you could play it via PlayStation Now. I think it's on there, but that's a streaming service, and
Yeah,
so that's totally different anyway. And I don't think that's a fair comparison if anyone makes that comparison. But obviously, I know some people do get annoyed that if it's not a full remake, ideally, like 60 frames per second, something better technically speaking. I
yeah,
know it's not just nothing improved; they have improved some stuff, but and then obviously the price as well. But it, the way I see it is, you just don't buy it. Like if it's that big of a deal, you obviously just don't buy it. But then there is obviously the other side of it. Like, does that take away from the developers' focus on newer games? They're obviously doing GTA 6 and whatever else, and maybe another Red Dead. But then I guess the other side is, does that allow them to make these good games because they can keep funding themselves without having to raise money and just obviously remaster? Because GTA 3 it came out on PS3 back in what 2013, then he came out on PS4 and PS5. It's been 10 years now. And obviously, some people are like, they just keep releasing the same game again and again. But if when GTA 6 comes out, if it is like a 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10, and it's like really big, massive scale, and it is one of those amazing games like GTA 5 was, I think it's like, okay, yes, they're releasing games again and again, but that's definitely helping them, fund their efforts of making this game. Because I think the estimates are GTA 6 will be $1 billion plus game in terms of the cost of making it.
yeah. Now that's a fair point. I think it also actually brings up another interesting side topic, which is the topic of backwards compatibility on consoles. Because it's interesting, like you took the example of GTA 5, which I think came on three different consoles now. Was it
Yeah,
PS3?
PS3, PS4,
Yeah.
and PS5.
And what's interesting is that on the other end, if you look at the PC, for instance, you can take any Windows, even any DOS window from the mid '90s, you can still run it on Windows 11. You see
Yes,
what I'm saying?
you might need
So
to do a bit of tweaking or maybe a mod, but
probably, probably,
yeah, but it can be done. I know what you mean, and that's great.
yeah. I think what's really frustrating also with certain console games is that, as I said, they're just locked to that particular platform.
Mm,
Like I take another example. One game that I would love to play in a remaster version would be Metal Gear Solid 4, for instance, which seems to be forever locked on the PlayStation 3 system. They never re-released it on PlayStation 4 or 5. I don't know if they have any plans, but essentially, if you don't own a PS3, you cannot play that game.
Yeah, and the problem, see, the PS3 is a very interesting platform because
Yes.
because of the cell architecture, it's made it very difficult, to have it on other systems. Because
Yeah.
if there wasn't already a it's like if they had a PC version as well that they created at the side, they probably could port that PC version to PS4 or PS5 easier. I guarantee you they can ported than they can the PS3 version or to Xbox. But if they only had predominantly had the PlayStation 3 version, then it's a lot. They are basically even doing a remaster is almost like a remake. I would say in terms of the amount of effort required because of the complexities of the PS3. I think Metal Gear Solid 4 definitely would get the sales. Like a lot of people
Yeah.
love that game, so uh, I think we might see it. You never know. Like this is definitely the era of remakes and remasters. So I think we could see Metal Gear Solid 4 potentially.
Let's hope so.
Is that your favorite one? Then I'm guessing.
It's not my favorite one, but it's I really liked it. It was a good one. Favorite one remains the third one for me.
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean those games, beloved by players. And the thing is, Metal Gear Solid is getting though like the earlier games, they're getting remakes, they're
Yeah.
getting or remasters, and they're coming onto different platforms. So it's not even like that franchise isn't going that direction. It is just like Metal Gear Solid 4. I mean, it's not a small game. That would definitely be a big undertaking, and then obviously to port it from the PS3 version. But yeah, I think they definitely would get the money of for it. So I think that would be very interesting. So working for Naughty Dog, what's your favorite game of Naughty Dog's? And that can go back way back all the way to Crash Bandicoot and beyond days.
That's a tough one. Um, Let me think about that one. I would probably, I'd say the most memorable one was probably Uncharted 2, to be honest,
Mm,
because that one was for me just like that massive spectacle. Like the first demo they showcased at E3. I think it was the train ride, or was
yes,
it?
that train scene. I think it
Yeah,
was a train scene. Yeah.
that was pretty impressive, and also just I would say just the overall pace of the game. It was just like nonstop, um, at times nonstop action, and it was just so immersive. The story was great, the characters were great, the gameplay mechanics were pretty solid at the time. So yeah, I mean, just looking at the history of Naughty Dog overall, I would say that's probably Uncharted 2 is probably the by far, I would say, actually my favorite Naughty Dog game.
Yeah, I mean, Uncharted 2 Among Thieves is, one of my favorites. I mean, they have amazing games in general, going back all the way to the Crash Bandicoot and Jack and Daxter days. But yes, Uncharted 2, because Uncharted 1, when you go back, you play, especially in its original,
Yeah.
form, it's good,
Mm.
but
Yeah.
you can tell that for the time, it's not quite where Uncharted 2 was. Uncharted 2 comes just blast
Yeah.
everything out the water, and I think he just
It
left.
was a massive leap forward.
Yes, like I,
Massive.
I
Yeah.
think it left every developer just looking like, what the hell
Yes.
are we just witnessing? I think it's like the Halo, the Half Life, these titles that you just like, what even? Like we can't even not, say it's amazing if even if you're a competitor, it's that good. It just hits on every single front, and it runs well, for the time as well. And I remember because in the UK games generally come out on a Friday, and there used to be actually there still is, there's a website called shop2.net. Back then, what they would actually do, that I don't think they ever admitted it, but they would basically ship games a little earlier and for a cheaper price than most other retailers, and they would get loads of sales that way. And I remember getting Uncharted 2 3 days before launch on a Tuesday, and that was very common. You would,
Wow.
if you got, this was funny with shop2.net back in the day, if you got a game on launch, and you ordered it from shop too, you was annoyed because you expected to get it, before launch. that, that's how
Yeah.
that particular website was. It's got so big now that they don't do that anymore. It is a more mainstream, retailer online. But yeah, I remember getting it like 3 days before launch, coming home, playing it, and completing it before it even came out on the Friday, and I was just that excited to play the game. And if I remember playing that train sequence, being in the snow, it was just something else.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know if you can still do that actually nowadays. Like if you get a game before, if you get a copy of the game before launch.
It's
Uh,
difficult with all the online checks because obviously
yeah, I
then
think
there
there are
was
some.
no online. I think even the
Yeah.
update, if there was an update, would have been available. But yeah, whereas with now, uh, obviously some sort of online connected one, definitely not. But even an offline one, you usually need a big ass update. There'll probably be this and that check, so it's difficult for that to happen. Now, I feel like it's even rarer to even have that, like the game come early compared to how he was. Because I remember in the UK, there's a shop called Argus,
Mhm.
and when Halo 3 came out on Xbox 360, the people, because the people in Argus, the shop, they had it delivered to them, I don't know, at least a week beforehand.
Yeah.
And but they didn't know about games, so somebody came in. They're like, "I want to buy Halo 3," and then they was like, "Okay, yeah, that's fine." They was like, on our system, it's not letting us, put it through, but we know we've got it here. So they literally just went and grabbed them one, manually put it in for the price that it was. And the reason it wasn't going through in the system because it wasn't out yet.
Oh wow.
Yeah. And I remember that was a bit of a thing initially because it's like you could just go to like Argus and some other retailers because Argus is not a game retailer. It just sells a variety of technical and just household items.
Hmm.
So there, the people would, unlike a game or some video game store that would obviously know when Halo, a big game like Halo's coming out. They didn't. I was like, yeah, here you go. It must just be a glitch on our system.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I mean, I don't hear about that sort of stuff, anymore. So, what's your favorite Gears game? Because you worked on a variety of Gears titles.
Let me think about that one too. That's hot. That's tough. Um, I'm not sure. It's either. You know what? I'm actually going to go for the original because just like what I just said about Uncharted 2 and how I'm just trying to put it in the context of the time, when it came out. Like I'm not looking at it as it is today, right? Just putting it back into the context of like back then when it came out in '06. It was just like there was just nothing like it. Um, my job, which is technical arts, I remember at the time, just got started in the industry. It just blew me away. It's like, how did they do it? It was just such a massive leap forward from the previous generation of consoles, which was the PS2 and the original Xbox and the GameCube era. That was to me the first like true next gen experience. Uh, the game mechanics, like the cover based shooter, that has for me defined an entire generation. Like you look at most of the games that came out during that generation, it really, I wouldn't say, because I know there were other games that attempted that before, but that cover based mechanics that it introduced and, the kills with like the chainsaw and all that kind of stuff. It was just like over the top and super well executed.
Mm.
Um, so I would go for the first one in the sense that for me, like historically speaking, when it came out, it really it just shook the entire industry from my perspective.
Oh yeah, I can. I remember playing, Gears of War myself, and like you said, there were other games with cover mechanics at the same time and before then. But whenever I think of some sort of game with that type of cover mechanic, Gears of War is the first one I think of.
Yeah.
Especially if I think of a game that's a bit heavier. Like Call of Duty was always very floaty,
Hmm.
and whereas Gears of War, it felt like you was actually moving people that size with armor that heavy
Yeah.
with those guns. Like it wasn't something that you could just whip across the map in 2 seconds. You had to be a bit more tactical as well,
Yeah.
with that. And obviously, that's where, the covering aspect, the blind fire, really, came into its own. And then obviously you had the chainsaw mechanics. And again, every time I play Gears, I always love the opportunity to be close to someone, an enemy, to
Yeah.
use that. Sometimes I'll end up killing myself because I'll run out just to try and get that kill, and it's just like if there's too many enemies, you're just gonna die. But yeah, anytime I can, trigger that event, and that's another thing because I know once you trigger it, the event is triggered, but it's almost like a early, quick time event kind of thing, or the kills that they have in the new Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal. I can't remember what the kills are called again, but that sort of style. And yeah, Gears definitely did innovate on that front,
Yeah, 100%. And,
and it
and as I
visually looked
said,
good as well.
oh, it looked phenomenal. I mean, at the time, it was, as I said. I mean, I don't think there was anything like it, even on PC. Quite frankly, it came out on
Mm.
Xbox 360 first. Even on PC, I don't think there was any game that even came close up until the release of the original Crisis. I think that came out a couple of months after that. Um, but what I would say also is that if you look back at that generation, Xbox 360, PS3, we had tons of third person shooters with like cover based mechanics. So it really did set, from my perspective, like really did set the standards for um, for that type of games, at least during that generation.
Oh yeah, 100%. And another game that I remember playing in the Xbox 360 era is Army of Two. I was playing it with my cousin because it was a game that you could play two player, and it was
Yeah.
optimized heavily for playing two player couch co op, and that had similar cover mechanics. But I still remember to this day that it felt not as refined. It was refined enough to enjoy the experience, but with Gears, very rarely have I played it, gone into the cover mechanics, and got annoyed because it didn't do what I wanted it to do. Most of the time, it does what I wanted to do or what I expected to do. Whereas other games like Army of Two, I'll be doing, I'll be like, oh, why did it do that? Or why did it do that? And obviously, the game overall was good enough, or both were, that I kind of just basically ignored those aspects. But yeah,
Mm.
Gears really did do it well, and the graphics as well. And that's an interesting one. Crisis coming out a little bit later, that was probably, if Crisis, I'd say, didn't come out at all and there was never any more game from Crytek, I feel like Gears probably would have been held to a greater light technically years on, because people still talk about the original Crisis. They don't talk about Gears in the same manner, in the same breath as the original Crisis. So I think technically, I think a lot of games got overshadowed by the original Crisis in '07.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think Crisis is still remembered to this day. To be honest, I think that yeah, the graphics were insane, but it's also remembered for being a benchmark for nearly a decade. A
Mm.
lot of websites that do like PC hardware reviews, like graphics card, they still used Crisis as a benchmark for performance, like a decade later. So yeah, I mean, you're probably right. Like if had Crisis not came out like so early, or like just a couple of months after Gears, maybe people would still be remembering the original Gears in a different light. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. But it is definitely phenomenal, like you were saying, what they achieved with, doing Gears on 360. Because I know they had a PC release a little later on, but initially it was 360, and what they achieved with that was, phenomenal. Because I remember at the time there was that thing, Xbox has Gears, and that was like, the new thing. Hey, the new Halo 3 hadn't come out yet, and PlayStation had, the Resistance franchise, Resistance Fallen Man, etc. And there's always that comparison. No matter how much I loved Resistance and I prefer it, I've got to admit, Gears overall did look better, in most of the areas.
Yeah, I personally think it did, but
So I mean, like, how, because you've worked at, you're working on Naughty Dog that does PlayStation games and now some PC games. You worked on, Gears, which is Xbox, only, and they do obviously have PC versions as well. But heavily PlayStation, heavily, Xbox. How do you feel about the two? Because you do get a lot of people that get very religious about PlayStation over Xbox, for example. Like, what's your opinion on it? And if you had to choose one, obviously I know you're working on Naughty Dog now, so the element of I've got to choose PlayStation. But if you had to choose one, which one would it be? Let's just say purely from like the games available that you enjoy.
you mean as a gamer?
Yeah.
Okay. Uh, I wouldn't really pick any to be honest. I think there are great games on all platforms. I have a Switch, I have a PlayStation, I have an Xbox. I play Halo, I play Gears, I play Uncharted, I play The Last of Us, I play Spider Man, Mario, and Zelda. And honestly, I think it's just I never really got into this sort of like console war thingy. Like I never really understood it, to be honest. I know some people get very religious about it, like you said. But from my perspective, it isn't so much about the brand or the hardware. It's very much about the games. That's
Mm.
what matters to me, right? So I don't really see myself picking, a brand over another because what matters to me is very much the end product, which are the games. The console is just a platform, right? You put a disc, you download a game, and then you play a game. Without games, a console is really just another box in your living room. So at the end of the day, uh, I can't really answer that question, to be honest, because I like a very wide variety of games that come out on all platforms. And yeah, I mean, right now I'm playing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles with my kids, who's 8 on the PlayStation 5. I could have played that on Xbox. Makes absolutely no difference to me. Um, I'm one of the games that I mostly highly anticipated for me is Starfield, which I might actually end up playing on PC. So we I've worked for Xbox, working for PlayStation. Doesn't that doesn't really change anything for me as a gamer, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
it totally does. And you're right, it does depend on the game. But, let's, talk about, let's say, the console generations. Because obviously, different consoles, different generations had their pros and their cons and the different titles. If you had to choose the games from, let's say, the PlayStation 3's era, I think, was that the 6th or the 7th generation? Which one would you
mhm.
prefer, PS3 or Xbox 360?
Wow. Uh, that's a really tough one because there were some really really great games on both. You see, it was an interesting generation because I think the first half of the generation I would have probably picked the 360. The
Hmm.
second half I would have probably picked the PS3. So when I look at that entire decade, it's really like for me it's really 50-50. Like it's just a wash because the first half for me, yeah, definitely the 360 was above, like had better games, arguably.
Mm-hmm.
And then Sony really brilliantly turned the tide with great exclusive games like Uncharted, God of War,
Killzone, those type of stuff.
Killzone.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Little Big
So
Planet. You know, I feel.
sure.
Yeah, I feel like Sony also, to this day, does this really well. They have the hardcore games that the
Mhm.
real hardcore fans and the gamers love, but then they have these really casual games like the Little Big Planets of the world that
Yeah.
just makes people that maybe not that into games or just want a slightly lighter experience. Really love. It's kind of what Nintendo has, but on PlayStation. I feel like I mean I can't think of any off the top of my head major Xbox exclusives that have that sort of same love for it, but I'm sure there are, but it's just not on the same level as a Little Big Planet. And obviously Crash Bandicoot is now multi-platform, but as Crash Bandicoot was back in the day.
Yeah, I mean, Microsoft did release a couple of those. I mean, it's true that we don't remember them as well as some of the PlayStation platforms, but I'm thinking of some of the games that Rare released, for instance, like Banjo Kazooie. They released one on the 360. Viva Pinata was also another one,
That was
but
a big one.
yeah,
Okay, so how about PS3 versus Xbox One?
PS3 versus Xbox One.
No,
So
sorry, PS4. PS4 versus Xbox One. Wrong.
okay. I yeah, I'd probably pick the PS4 this time around because there were some great games on Xbox One. Don't get me wrong, and I actually owned an Xbox One before I owned a PS4. But overall, I look at the entire generation. Yeah, I'd definitely pick the PS4.
Yeah, and I think by the time PS4 came, round, Sony came out swinging, from the gate, from the start. They just came, with title after title, and it was, obviously more optimized. Things were just, the online side of it was better because obviously 360 came out what in '06 and not '05, and the PS3 in Japan and US came out in '06. In UK came out in 2007. There was a little bit behind, and then they were playing catch up because obviously the cell architecture, did not help them at all. So they were playing catch up for the first half of the generation because I think they had got so used to dominating with their PS1 and PS2 that nothing literally could touch it. That when the 360 came around, its price was significantly cheaper. It had a lot of titles that either were new or established, and they played well compared to you had because obviously the PS3 overall was a more powerful system, but when you had titles initially, multi-platform games running worse than they did on Xbox, running worse on PlayStation, obviously a lot of people didn't like that. But yeah, later on things picked up. But yeah, in PS4 versus Xbox One, PS4 I agree as well. It's still ongoing. PS5 and Xbox Series.
I would still pick PS5 at this point. I mean, Starfield, I think, is coming out next week.
Yeah, it is.
I might change a few things. I cannot wait for the next Gears game. That would be great. And I think Microsoft did well, investing in new studios. So I think Xbox has a bright future. I think it's great. We're going to see more competition, but so far in the current generational cycle, I have to give the advantage to the PS5.
Yeah, I mean, for sales, for games, for I also like that PlayStation. Like the interface there. Oh, like it is. It does feel like a new system. Whereas Microsoft has definitely gone down the route of this is kind. It's like a new system, but it's like just like a better Xbox One. It's like how with the iPhone, you get an iPhone 12, you get an iPhone 14. It's better, but you know what you're expecting. That's the same with Xbox. Like the interface, it's the same. Like you're not gonna look at it and be like, this is totally different. In many ways, that's good because somebody that may not play that much, but let's say has the money to go and buy it will appreciate that. But then it also means that it is the same. And when you're spending £400 plus or for $500 plus on a console, you're like, am I just kind of getting the same thing again that I had last time? Whereas with PlayStation, it actually feels like something more. But they've had some interesting titles. I think Microsoft and Xbox is doing a very good long-term plan with all of their studios they've acquired. Because obviously PlayStation really did well with the PlayStation Plus, but then Xbox has, I think, knocked them out the water with their Game Pass and the Game Pass Ultimate, because the amount of title, like you get Halo day one, Flight
Yeah.
Simulator day one, you'll probably get Gears, day one, Stalker
Forza.
day one. Like you're
Yeah.
getting these
Yeah.
like the best Xbox titles day one. That's just insane.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It is pretty insane. I think it just shows how both companies' strategies have diverged over the
Mm,
years. Like you can feel that Sony is very much in this traditional console manufacturer mindset where you attract players to your platforms with exclusive experiences, whilst what Microsoft is trying to do, I guess, with the Game Pass and also the decision that they made a couple of years ago to release their games day one on PC, as well as the service that they have on cloud streaming on mobile, is to essentially meet players where they are. Essentially, right? It's like you don't need to own the console. You can start a Game Pass subscription and play all of those great games day one: the Gears, the Halos, the Forza, the Fables. So yeah, I guess a slightly different strategy, and it probably ties into what you said also about the user interface. I guess because Microsoft, I like the analogy that you took with the iPhone. I guess that's also what they're trying to do, where each new console is essentially an iteration over the previous one. Like you remain within the same uh, ecosystem, and you just upgrade like from one machine to a more powerful one, and you keep your entire catalog of games, right? So yeah, I guess just slightly different strategies.
Oh yeah, definitely. I agree that Sony is doing the more traditional, route with it, whereas Microsoft trying, new things, and it is like, it doesn't kind of really matter which Xbox you get. The game's probably gonna work on all of them. From Xbox, one onwards, and like if you don't want to spend $500 on the latest console, it's fine. You can get one for $200,
Yeah.
and you'll be able to play a lot, most if not all of the games to to some varying degree. And that's being a strategy. And I think what's really worked well with Microsoft is because they've obviously got Windows. They know what they're doing on PC. They know how to code for the PC as well with DirectX and all of that, all the other technologies behind the scenes, that when they do bring a game to PC, by and large, theirs performs better, I would say, than a PlayStation exclusive game that comes to PC, at least initially. Obviously, you get updates that come out for the PlayStation games on PC to, improve it. Because whereas, these big PlayStation titles on PlayStation, the Uncharted, the God of Wars, and all these other ones, they work really well day one on PlayStation. But when they sometimes hit PC, they're not the best. Whereas when Xbox games hit the PC, sometimes they could need an update, but they're not like terrible, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. I think it's also just two completely different, type of developments, if I may say.
Mm.
Where on one hand, as I said, as far as I understand, as far as I remember, working with Xbox a couple of years ago, it was a requirement to release your game on PC. Uh, same date, Xbox and PC. So the entire development process is essentially done in such a way that the game works well on both platforms on day one. You know, whilst on the PlayStation side, right, we're talking about ports. So the game comes out on the console first, and then you give the development team enough time to port that game over to PC. So yeah, it's just a little difference, I'll say.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Just circling back a little bit, we was talking about, subscriptions, PlayStation Plus, and, Game Pass Ultimate, all of that stuff. Like, what's your opinion on that? Because, Microsoft has purchased a lot of studios. They're still trying to get that Activision Blizzard deal go through, which I think they will. They'll probably have to sacrifice a few things as they're already doing, but it'll be stuff that doesn't really matter, probably to their core strategy anyway. But yeah, they'll get that deal that they'll have all these games that I know Phil Spencer and Xbox is saying they're gonna remain on all these other consoles, and they say for at least X amount of years, and we don't have any plan for the foreseeable future for taking them off of Nintendo and PlayStation systems. But we all know, given the chance, they would rather have everyone buy an Xbox, just the way Sony would rather have everyone buy a PlayStation. Nintendo would rather have everyone buy a Switch and buy games on their system. So with all these titles, Microsoft is naturally going to put them on, Game Pass. Fair enough. They're going to put a lot of them, if not all of them, the newer ones in the franchise, day one as well. So my question is, do you think this is good for the industry, or do you think it can get a bit too much where it might actually hurt the gamer?
That's a tough question. I guess time will tell, really. But I think competition is good.
It is.
That's how I look at it. Now, you took the example of like the recent acquisition of Activision Blizzard, and we know like the whole thing is about Call of Duty, right? It's all Call of Duty. Like people are talking about Activision Blizzard, but no, it's actually
it,
Call of Duty.
it is Call of Duty, and with
It's
a bit
all
of
about Call of
Diablo,
Duty.
but it's mainly COD.
Yeah, it's all about Call of Duty. Let's face it. But
And now Warzone as well with them heavily.
yeah, well, I mean, Microsoft said that they will continue to release those games. And to be fair, I mean, they've done that in the past when they purchased Mojang, and
Yes,
Minecraft.
true.
My kid is still playing Minecraft on a PS5, and you have millions of people playing Minecraft on Nintendo and PlayStation platforms. Like, why would Microsoft end support for those millions of consumers and potentially cut themselves off some millions of sales on other platforms? And I go back to the strategy thing that I was talking about earlier. I don't think it is really their intention for every single gamer out there to buy an Xbox. I think what they want is just your Game Pass subscription. That's it. Where do you want to play? Do you want to play on your smart television? You don't have a console? Fair enough. You can stream Xbox games. You have a Game Pass subscription. I don't think bringing in more people to the Xbox ecosystem via the consoles is really their primary strategy. That's how I look at it. I might be wrong, right? But that's how I look at it. Is it good long term for gamers? I don't know. Like, I've never. On one hand, I think, as I said, competition is great, but I also miss the days where third party publishers, third party developers could freely support whichever console they wanted, right? And I fear that by moving more and more of those like large third party publishers towards a particular console manufacturers, we might actually end up in a situation where one platform is favored over another, for instance. Like, that might be DLC or whatever it may be, right? So yeah, I guess only time will tell, to be honest. Uh,
Yeah, I mean that's something that I've been thinking about probably over the last 2 3 years as well. Is that back in the day, especially I'd say up to PS3 and 360 era, there were a lot of games. They weren't 9 and 10s out of 10. They weren't that, but they were 7 and 8s, and they were like a nice experience. They were different from your Uncharted, your Call of Duties, your Halos. They had a lot different take on it, and they were a good experience. In between, like it's a good filler game in between these major titles. And because I remember a game, I think John Woo's Stranglehold on 360, Time Shift, Actually, I think Stronghold may have been on PS3 as well, potentially. But that time shift as well. Those games, I don't think any of them were like a 10 out of 10. They were probably 7 or 8 at the best. But they were fun experiences, and I find it very difficult to believe that those games could exist in the state of gaming today. Also, partly because a lot of things have gone online, and I think that's another valuable thing to say is that with the amount of money that's been thrown around in games like Fortnite, PUBG, Warzone, there's obviously less incentive, and obviously you got mobile as a big platform. So some developers will be like, "Why even touch PlayStation and Xbox or even Nintendo when we can just go straight to mobile? At least then it's less costly to make the game, and we'll see if it does well or not." But yeah, I know what you mean. I totally agree. It is a shame, and I have noticed it that there are less and less, studios that are doing games that are a little smaller, maybe not as good, but still a nice experience and a little different. And obviously, the problem is, as these big studios are just, absorbing these smaller studios, they obviously become part of their culture. And if the bigger studios are just getting absorbed by PlayStation or Xbox, then it will have to eventually, on some level, fit their narrative. So if there may have been a studio that may have done a Gears clone with their own twist on it that may have been a fun experience, how likely do you think that studio is to do that same game under a studio that is owned by Xbox now?
Yeah, yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I think uh, part of it is also just the fact that that's really the reality of the business nowadays,
It is,
especially in
yeah.
the AAA space, where uh, games are just becoming more and more expensive to make.
Mm.
That's the reality of it. And so from a business standpoint, you tend to become a little bit more risk averse, if that makes any sense. In the sense that the failure of a big AAA game today in the current context might also mean, shutting down the studio at some point. People losing their jobs and everything that goes on with it. So I totally get your concerns. I think it's unfortunately, I think part of it is just business, and it's just inevitable. When you have those large corporation, looking for a buyer, well, whoever has the highest bids does pretty much whatever they want at this point, right?
Oh yeah,
So I think it becomes more of a business conversation at some point, and the games are essentially secondary in that conversation.
Oh yeah, I don't think there's always an element of the business side of it, but yeah, it is heavily that, and we as gamers are partly to blame because we want these really big, rich worlds, and
Mm-hmm.
you're seeing how long it's taking Rockstar, a AAA studio, to release their next game because they know if they came out with a GTA 5 but it was branded as GTA 6, people will not be happy. They want something on another, level, and they need that. Obviously, some games go down. I mean, some studios go down the route like Naughty Dog, where they have a richer story, better character development, the better animation. They have tighter game mechanics. Some go down the other route of let's just make it as big as we can. You was talking about Starfield. That's effectively a byproduct of just getting bigger, bigger, bigger. Yeah, and it's I remember with was it 2016 I'll say with No Man's Sky,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
what it was. It's just like let's just get as big as we can. Okay, one island is not big enough. A whole planet is not big enough when in reality, when you think about it, that's more than big enough, for the most part, to get a rich experience. Let's have a whole, solar system, a whole galaxy, a whole universe, that you can explore. And then, gamers get pissed that, it's not as engaging, on any of those
Yeah.
planets
Yeah.
as a game that might have cost 100 million, but they're only focusing on one island. It's like, I think No Man's Sky gets a lot of hate, unfair hate considering the size of the studio that it was when they first came out, what they achieved technically, and the fact that they still to this day are giving free updates. I think that's a
Yeah,
testament to to their vision, and I don't think a big studio would. I think they would can the project before they did what No Man's Sky did.
I agree. I agree definitely. Um, yeah, I mean, scale is a big topic actually in this industry because open worlds are becoming more and more common. Like even sometimes from well-known franchises that weren't traditionally open worlds, they are now going open worlds. And I think it's really a trade-off between the scale of your game and also like from a production perspective, how much can you actually fit in that within that large scale world, with like relevant content? Because there is no point of having like a super large, open world if half of it is empty, right? Like you have to populate that large open world with like relevant, uh, you know, side quest or whatever it may be, and that's a lot of work, and it's in the end, it's why the cost of games is just skyrocketing because on one hand the quality overall, is going up. Like gamers expect more and more and more every single generation, and then you have to add in the scale factor on top of that. So it has to be bigger and better, right? So in a context like this, as I said, like if you have to make some of those business decisions, as I was saying earlier with the whole Activision Blizzard thing, or Call of Duty, because we all know it's all about Call of Duty. You tend to become, as I said, more risk averse, and some of those like riskier projects, I would say, at least on paper, sometimes they just don't even get the green lights, because it's either too risky or it's not big enough or whatever it may be.
Yeah, I mean that would definitely be a decision, especially from a studio that has, you know, a fair bit of money that can, take that risk. And like say, if a team is saying, let's do this, you'll probably sell well on the medium scale, but you'll be a smaller game, and but fans will love it. They'll be like, everyone else is going super big, everyone's going open world, everyone's going online, everyone's doing this and this, and then like you just see it with games like Halo. They removed couch co-op, whether that was playing the single
Mhm.
player or whether that was playing online. That was like one of the things about Halo outside of the story and the gameplay that people knew was the fact that it was co-op and you could do it all the time. It comes out and it's like, okay, it doesn't have co-op, but it's coming. So it's just like, okay, it's annoying, but it's coming. Then they're like, oh, it's basically on indefinite hold. So it's just like I can't even, you know, play couch co-op Halo and play the single player. So it is really annoying. And then they said I think that they'll have it online initially, so you could be where you are, I could be where I am on let's say on X, on PC and play the campaign, but we won't be in the same room effectively. But then they didn't even do that, and they're just taking away features that are core to the franchise or was to the franchise, and it gets to a point where it's just like you're just taking away. But again, they're making those business and financial decisions that just make sense. And then I think Naughty Dog, when they did the Uncharted 4 and they had a huge, open section. Uh, and I think they did that really well because I remember when I got to that and it was a bit more open in nature compared to because Uncharted is usually very linear. And I remember thinking this is different for Uncharted, but I never think, oh, that was bad. I
Mm.
think that's probably one of the areas in Uncharted 4 that people love and still think about was that open, level, but they did it so well and they didn't go crazy and say, you know what, we're just gonna go from Uncharted 3 to Uncharted 4 to being fully open and it's an RPG now, which I feel like a lot of studios are doing that on some level.
Yeah. I think some studios are also there's actually an alternative route, which is to essentially take a an already existing franchise and create like a side project like that isn't necessarily canon. I
Hmm.
think the studio behind Yakuza did that very well recently when they introduced the Like a Dragon. I don't know if you're familiar with the franchise. They essentially have like two main arcs. They have like an RPG, like turn-based RPG. Um, it's the same franchise, but it's just two different kind of games, and I think it's definitely a viable option. Like if you want to stay true to the core values of your franchise, you can carry on with the old formula and modernize it over the years. And if you really want to take like a U-turn and try something completely different, you might as well introduce within the same franchise like a different arc in the story, whatever it may be, and release a completely different type of games. In fact, the last game I worked on at Splash Damage was Gears Tactics. It was a tactics based game, but the story of the game is actually canon, right? But it's a completely different type of game. Like it's not a third person shooter game. It's a tactics game like XCOM. So that's also in my view an alternative approach so to those kind of things.
And we're all like that, Gears did with Gears Tactics, even though, I had to go, the game, wasn't for me. I never, you know, expected that game to be anything other than it was. It wasn't like they had, released the new Gears 6 and, they said it's the new Gears, yeah, it's going to be like
Yeah.
the old one, but then they changed a bunch of things. It was like,
Mm.
this isn't feeling like Gears anymore. And I feel like a lot of people will not have bought Gears Tactics because it wasn't the Gears they loved, but they on a level, on a subconscious level, they appreciate that they knew it wasn't what they wanted. It was not, some sort of, switcheroo of like, okay, it's Gears, but it's not Gears. It's like how you had Halo Wars. It's in
Yeah.
the Halo franchise.
Another great example.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and they did it well considering it was on, obviously they had a PC version, but like on a controller they did it really well, one and
Yeah.
two. But
I
it
agree.
was like, okay, if you want a strategy game and you want Halo, great, have this. If you don't, you've got the other core Halo games, and so you knew what you was getting
Yeah.
from it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, I mean, that's all the more specific question. Before we wrap up, I always do some fun generic questions,
All
rapid
right.
fire. But before we do that, I just want to, ask a couple of things about, your journey and about your career. So, what's been your biggest regret in your journey? Because you've had a long journey, having a couple of degrees, I say getting into the gaming industry when you're still pretty young, working at a variety of companies, including, working on titles like Last of Us, Gears, really big ones. What's been your biggest regret in your journey so far? And what advice would you give to someone else looking to follow in your footsteps and become some sort of artist in the gaming industry, but, from more of a like a technical level?
My biggest regret. I'm not sure I can actually find one because, to be honest, looking back at my experience, I think every single failure that I came across has actually been a great learning experience. And quite frankly, I'm not entirely sure I would do anything differently. Like depending on just considering the situation um, I was in at the time. What would be my biggest regrets? I'm not entirely sure. Maybe I should have tried to get in the games industry earlier in my career instead of uh, taking a slight detour via an engineering job in a different industry. Maybe I should have started something else. Maybe QA would have been a good starting point, and it still is in the games industry. Um, I'm not entirely sure. I know it doesn't answer your question, but it's really really hard because when I look back at the past and I'm like, there are a couple of things that I would have probably done differently with my perspective today, but overall, I wouldn't change anything.
Okay. And actually, one more question before we get into the
Sure.
fun, generic ones. So, your name is, Raouf.
Yeah.
That is an Arabic, name. I'm
Mhm.
guessing your family is Arabic or from one of those countries?
Originally from North Africa. Yes.
Originally from North Africa.
Yeah.
So obviously, it's kind of linking back to what we discussed at the start. What did your family and parents want you to be before you expressed that you wanted to go into the games industry?
Uh, I don't think they really had like any specific aspiration when it comes to like my professional career. I guess they just wanted me to succeed. That's it. And I guess for them being successful is like having, you know, a good job and probably, I guess, with their mentality, like not manual labor, which is what they did their entire life,
Mm-hmm.
right? So getting a good education and they were pretty open about whichever career I wanted to pursue. It was just like the game side of thing, as I said. It wasn't really something that they were taking seriously. Up until this day, I don't think they still take it very seriously, quite frankly, because it's probably, as I said, it's just like amusement, right? Like for for young kids, right?
Yeah.
But in the end, yeah, I think things turned out pretty well for me. Growing up as the child of immigrant parents in a poor suburban area of Paris, all the way here to sunny Santa Monica. So yeah.
So how do they compare Santa Monica to Paris and Europe?
Uh, yeah, pretty. I love it here. I mean, just looking out the window right now, the weather is great. Family loves it. Uh, yeah, it's just nothing really to complain about.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, has your accent changed? Because you don't strike me as someone who was born in France from your accent.
Well, I traveled a lot. I mean, I lived for like nearly a decade in the UK when I was working at Splash Damage.
Oh,
I've worked
whereabouts in the UK?
in suburban area of London,
London. Sorry, London.
and I've also worked a little bit in Canada. So yeah, I guess my accent has kind of like morphed over the years, and I often get that from native English speakers. Like I can't really tell where you actually
No,
come
yeah,
from.
you
So
can't. And now that you mentioned Canada, I can. I don't know. I feel like that's probably the most part of your accent is Canadian to
okay,
my ears, more than definitely not British. I wouldn't say French either, or and it's not American either. It's not very Americanified either.
so it's an international accent.
Yeah, it's international. It's the accent that when Naughty Dog wants to do a video that everyone can understand, but nobody can figure out where it's from, then they get Ralph in. Okay, so doing the fun generic questions before we wrap up. Okay, if you was to run your own company, your own game studio, would you
Mhm.
rather run a 10-person studio or a 1,000-person studio, and why?
Definitely 10. Definitely 10 because I really want to get involved, with things. Like even as a like in a director position, I've always been very hands-on with stuff, and it's just I guess part of my like just one of my personality traits because from my perspective, working in tech, you have to constantly update your knowledge, if that makes any kind of sense. Like you have to practice. for yourself. And it's one of those things where I don't really see myself with a like managing 1,000 size company, because I might be part of the process at the very top, but what I really appreciate also about game development as a whole is actually getting my hands dirty, right? And I don't really see how I could possibly do that with 1,000 person company. So definitely 10 for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
And would you rather have 5 million US dollars up front or 500,000 a year for the rest of your life, and why?
uh, I'd probably, I guess, like most people, I'd probably pick the 500K annually, but I would think about it, honestly. I'd probably end up picking the 500K, but I would think about it very, very strongly.
Okay, I
Um,
mean, I can imagine your reasoning for 500,000, and you're right. Most people on the podcast have chosen the 500,000. Very few people have chosen the 5 million option. But what would be your logic behind potentially choosing the 5 over the 500?
okay, so you just look around the world. I mean, I live in California nowadays, and you might think that we are all protected by a big, massive financial crash or whatever it may be. But you look at certain countries like Greece, Argentina, where the value of their currency has literally, deprecated overnight, right? And I don't think it is an unwise choice to take a big sum of money upfront and actually invest it in tangible assets, like something that has intrinsic value, right? That wouldn't really depreciate over time like paper money, right? So in the end, I would probably go for the 500K a year, but I would strongly think about it.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that's a interesting point that you bring up, especially when you talk about Greece as well, and there's other countries that you can use as an
Yeah,
example over the years. Is that it can go from 500,000 being a lot of money to most
yeah,
people to it
to like a
being
loaf of bread,
virtually very very little. And
Yeah.
but it also, I like the other bit that you added at the end is investing it into tangible assets, because
Mhm.
obviously if you take that 5 million, but let's say if you was in Greece before it all, went to hell, if you took the equivalent, say 5 million euros, and you just
Mhm.
sat on it, the like that over there, the whatever the currency is, it euros or do they have their own one? They have their own one, don't they?
Yeah, I don't think Greece is a great example actually, because I think they were already in the eurozone back then. But
Yeah, but if
you
they
look at other
weren't, I
countries,
know there's a
like
variety of African countries,
I think it's
that
Zimbabwe, where they have like
yeah, like it's gone
banknotes with like
crazy.
10 zeros, I think, written on them.
On
Where
the actual note itself, like
yeah,
it's not that bad
yeah,
that they just created new notes that are worth $1 billion or $1 trillion.
yeah,
They're not even trying to say, okay, this is it's temporary, or we'll just print more money. It's a matter of the notes just have to become $1 billion or $1 trillion, X amount of Zimbabwean, whatever they call them. So yeah,
yeah,
it is definitely one thing. But yeah, investing it into tangible assets is definitely a key thing, because you don't want to be sitting on money, because that's a big thing for me. Is I don't, obviously if you're spending money, whether good or bad, that's different. You need it to spend, and you can.
mm,
It's a separate conversation of what do you need, what do you want, and what do you absolutely not. You not spend on at all, because once is still okay, but extra cash that I have outside of emergency funds, for me it's like invest it, like put it into property, put it into potentially stocks, something that like if you have property, the reality is in the UK in 20, 30 years your property is probably going to be okay. Like
yeah,
you still got a house. Yes, there
mm,
are some places, especially if you're doing some new development, like purchasing in some new development off plan, where the city doesn't work out. But if it's in a city or a country that's been around for ages and nothing's really changing, you probably won't get the crazy growth in 2 years, but you'll
yeah,
get the steady growth in 20, 30 years. And you'll be like, that 100,000, 200,000 I invested is not only worth more, it can easily buy what 100, 200,000 would have done back then, if not more now.
absolutely. Absolutely. And I guess we don't have to take an example as extreme as Zimbabwe or Argentina, but look at any, like, you know, documentary in the US or even in the UK, you know, when you talk about previous investments made in London, for instance, they say, oh, in the 1970, the local government spent, I don't know, £1 billion. They will always say, in today's money, that would be equal to, you know, X, whatever it may be.
And it's always
And when
more.
you, exactly, and it's a lot more actually. When you look at how money has been depreciated over the years, it's actually quite scary. So I'm not saying that the 500K would be worthless in 10 or 15 years time, but I don't think the person picking the 5 million upfront, and as I said, like immediately investing that into um, not paper money, anything else that
Yeah.
you know, doesn't devalue as much over the years. Uh, I think it could be longer term a smarter move.
Oh yeah, it definitely could be if you have the know-how and the willingness to do it and learn. Because if you're just going blind and you don't know, because I know some people probably think, I'm just gonna grab the 5 million, start a business. Trust me, I've seen it. It can go
Yeah,
like that. I've seen people raise money from venture capitalists over $1 million, dollars worth, and like 2 years later, the company's in liquidation and they've got no money left. And there was only two or three people like on the company, but because they just outsourced this, they hired this expensive this. Because I was like, oh yeah, no, we really need this expensive designer, even though they didn't,
yeah,
or they'll get ripped off by a lawyer for charging. Like I knew somebody that had like a startup funding. It was $500,000, and he was gone in 2 3 years, and their lawyer, like one of the because there was two guys that founded this company,
hmm,
and my friend, he was a bit more, I'd say, on it with certain expenses, but he wasn't privy to everything that was going on. Like the other founder, like he had sorted all the lawyer out, and my friend just assumed he knew what he was doing. He was charging something like £5-10 per paper copy of a document or something, like a black and white copy, and then charging like he was charging money for paper clips, and they weren't cheap either. And like all of that was just obviously he was just like, oh, we got £500,000, what's £5-10 here and there for a paper copy. I mean, I understand 20p maybe, or even a pound if you want to, go really crazy. But when you're already throwing loads of money at them and they're doing that to you, and it's not just them. You'll because anyone, if somebody comes up to you and be like, "I'll make you a logo," it'd be 10 grand. And if you say yes to them, they're not gonna say, "Oh, nah, I think it should only be £1,000." They're gonna be like, "Yeah, I'll do for 10,000." And you need this extra. Yeah, so it's a crazy one. So, what's your favorite board game, video game, and movie?
uh, ooh, really tough. I'm not really a board game guy, to be honest, so I can't really give you an answer to that. Last one I played was probably, I don't know, 20 years ago when I was a child. Movie, definitely the original Mad Max. That remains like just the pinnacle for me. Video games, that is a really tough one. So many. Uh, oh gosh. I'm not sure I can actually answer that one. That is. Hmm, probably want to go for. Oh gosh, no, that's not true. um, that is really tough. That is a surprisingly difficult question to answer. Um, you know what? I'm going to go for a classic. I'll say the original Sonic the Hedgehog.
Okay, so the OG
Yeah, I'll go
platforming
for a
2D
classic.
one.
Yes.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, talking about that, do you play any of these classic games now, and especially when they come on platforms like the Switch and on mobile?
Uh, Not anymore, to be frank. Unless it is like a big release, like something that hasn't been released in a very, very long time. Because I've played most of those games like again and again and again, especially in my teenagehood. So no,
No, fair enough.
sometimes, but yeah,
Yeah.
not really.
Okay. So, what video game are you looking forward to the most outside of Starfield? Because I feel like your
Outside
answer
of
was going to be
Starfield,
Starfield.
okay.
I feel like that was going to be your answer.
Uh, that's also a tough one. Uh, there is Spider-Man 2 coming out
That's very soon, actually. Is that in
later
September
this
or
year.
October?
I think it is in October. Um, but you know what? Actually, I'm gonna go for another one. I actually forgot the name of the game. It's developed by a Chinese studio. They recently showcased it at Gamescom. Uh, was it?
I don't know. I want to say I know the game you're thinking of. Is it the one with the monkey in there?
Yes, Black Myth.
Black Myth Wukong or whatever it is. Yeah, well, when it's a
Black
Chinese
Myth
company,
Wukong.
I
Yeah.
was like, it's probably the monkey one. I couldn't quite remember
Yes,
what the name
yes,
was.
that is definitely the one. Yeah, I just Googled it, actually. I'm cheating. Black Myth Wukong, yeah, definitely. I am super excited about this game because
It looks just crazy
it
and
looks, oh yeah,
interesting.
it looks gorgeous, but also you don't really see that very, very often. You know, it's like a traditional, medieval Chinese settings.
Yeah,
We've known that with many Japanese games for more than 2 decades now. But this is really the first time we're seeing like a big budget AAA, you know, Chinese game in like a typical, as I said, medieval Chinese settings. And it looks phenomenal, really.
it does.
Super excited about this
And the
game.
art style and direction and like the
Oh yeah,
scale of things. It's like, Planet of the Apes meets something like God of War
yes,
or
yes,
Shadow of
exactly.
Colossus kind of
Yeah,
thing, but with some sort of Ghost of Tsushima artistry
yeah,
wrapped around it.
yeah, and a bit of a touch of Devil May Cry, I would say. Also,
Yeah.
when you look at the combats, yes,
I just hope that game is good because you get some games like that that's heavily hyped up and they come out and it's like, not the best. Let's just go back to Call
yeah.
of Duty. But I hope so. It's shaping up good, so I hope so
It
too.
is.
Technically, it looks good though.
Yeah.
So, final question, two-parter: does money buy you happiness, and what does a good life mean to you?
Does my money buy you happiness? No, I don't think it does. I think money can solve short-term problems. Uh, I don't think money in itself can buy you happiness. No. What does a good life mean? Yeah, that's very personal. um, I guess just being surrounded by people that you love and appreciate. You know, that's really what happiness is all about for me, at least. I know it sounds a bit cliche, but yeah,
It's the
that's my
answer.
answer.
It's the answer a lot of people give. So I mean, there's probably something in it.
Yeah.
The fact that a lot of people do give those answers. So that's all the questions I've got. I just want to thank you, Raouf, for coming onto the
Oh,
podcast.
thank
It's
you.
been great to obviously hear about your experience in the gaming industry. Obviously, starting out, doing the couple of degrees that you did and how that panned out, how the industry has changed. Learning about what a technical artist director does in relation to what people would think a regular artist does, and all the the different levels, and this is the thing I keep seeing across the podcast is different. Like you'll get a one like title in different companies and different projects. It can mean something totally different. Like
Yeah.
the technical art on one could be heavily technical, heavily coding based. Then on one,
Hmm.
it could be heavily animation based. So yes, the as a little takeaway, if you're interested in one over the other, have a look at what it actually involves. Don't just look at the job title, because it's like junior, mid, and senior. I find especially with mid and senior, they can be very easily blended together. Like in one company, you'll get a mid that's doing more and has more responsibility than a senior in another company. So definitely check out the roles that you're going for and seeing what it involves and if that's for you.
Absolutely.
Yep. So I just want to thank you, Ralph, for coming on. It was great. Thanks everyone for listening to this episode of FireDEV, and I'll see everyone next week. Bye bye.